Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Welcome to part 2 of our lecture regarding the New Deal. Now, we left off discussing, the Depression, of course, FDR's response to the Depression, which was, of course, the New Deal. And we left off with the creation of what was called the First New Deal. And having staved off a slide into deeper depression, FDR in 1935 began what he called the Second New Deal. Now, in many ways, it is a continuation of the First New Deal, but it would expand some of its more successful programs, such as government-paid jobs. And this included some organizations like the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. So in 1935, FDR begins phase 2, the Second New Deal. In this phase, we'll see a continuation of those government-paid jobs. And so the WPA is going to employ millions of unemployed people, mostly unskilled men, to carry out public works projects, including things like the construction of public buildings and roads. Yes, but also it would employ musicians, artists, writers, actors, directors. It would embark in large art projects, dramas, media, even literacy projects. So we see things like the Road Project, but also the recreation of a Spanish folk dance through the arts program. Here we see a Spanish band and dancer in San Diego, California. So music. We see literacy and citizenship classes. In this case, for Spanish American group. Again, that was a term that how the photograph was tagged. Why it says Spanish American. But make no mistake, these are Mexicanos. Here's an orchestra employed in San Antonio. Here's another orchestra in California on the right, and a vaudeville performer on the left in San Francisco. And of course, one of the biggest things they did, even though it's not necessarily part of Mexican American history, was the WPA Federal Writers Project, Enslaved Narratives. And what they did was they sent people out to interview formerly enslaved African Americans. Now you have to realize, these formerly enslaved in 1935, we're already talking, this is going to be 70 years since the end of the Civil War, which means if they are able to remember enslavement at all, they had to be at least 10. If they actually remember experiencing much themselves, 20, which puts them in their late 70s up to about 90 years old. And so there are some issues with the project as far as who's doing the interviewing, a white person, interviewing an African American. You have problems of memory. You have problems just of time. But nonetheless, these enslaved narratives are just so awesome as a historian to have, to read through, to understand and recreate what life was really like in the South in the antebellum period. Nonetheless, though, this WPA project would hire unemployed Mexican Americans on relief jobs throughout the Southwest, both rural and urban. Though many, however, did not qualify for relief assistance because they did not meet the residency requirement, because many were migrant workers. So if you're a migrant worker who doesn't have residency in a certain area, oftentimes you didn't qualify. And again, this was not written this way to explicitly against Mexicanos, but again, the way it's implemented. But despite these shortcomings, the WPA employed hundreds of thousands of African Americans, Asians, Mexicanos, and Native American citizens. And they were not only men doing manual labor, which is kind of the stereotypical idea of these jobs programs. Women of color were hired as teachers, social workers, librarians. And in other professional sectors, they even worked on integrated teams. But the biggest part of the second New Deal was the creation of a social safety net. In other words, how do we prevent this from ever happening again? So it's one thing to put people to work in the immediate part, but how do we keep this from ever happening again? And if it does start to happen, how can we provide for people so they don't lose their homes? And one answer was, of course, the very important Social Security Act. Now, you have to realize, back in 1933, when FDR was elected, he will appoint the first female Secretary of Labor in one Frances Perkins. And she remembers when she was interviewed about this, she remembers that she only accepted the position on the condition that he would back her goals, which included things like unemployment insurance, health insurance, old age insurance, a 40-hour work week, minimum wage, abolition of child labor. She was a staunch labor advocate from her days in New York City. She later recalled saying, quote, "I remember that he looked so startled," referring to the things that she's saying that she wants to get done. And he replied back to her saying, quote, "Well, do you think it can be done?" Unquote. And so once in office, Perkins becomes this driving force behind the administration's massive investment in public works projects to get people back to work. She urged the government to spend $3.3 billion on schools, roads, housing, post offices. These projects employed more than 1 million people in 1934, like with the CCC and later the WPA. And so in order to implement her vision, though, to her goals that she outlined to FDR early on, she was instrumental in trying to create a social safety net to prevent the homelessness of the Depression from ever happening on such a wide scale again. And so in 1935, FDR is going to sign the Social Security Act, providing ordinary, everyday Americans with unemployment insurance, old age insurance, to provide funds and promote maternal and child welfare, public health services. And so the Social Security Act of 1935, FDR announced as the New Deal's cornerstone and supreme achievement, established a pension fund for retired people over the age of 65 and their survivors, paid through payroll taxes, paid by employers and workers. The benefits began in 1940 and averaged a small fraction, $22 a month, a modest sum. FDR stressed that pension programs were not intended to guarantee a comfortable retirement, only to supplement other forms of income. Only later does Social Security become a primary source of retirement income. But this was one of the major centerpieces of this New Deal. But the reality is, it was pretty conservative in its inception. It initially excluded 9.5 million workers. So remember, this is a program that you all will pay into as you get jobs. And the idea is that you pay it all your life, you pay into this fund, and then the government is a trust for you that invests the money, and you have money in return when you turn age 65. You get Social Security. And this helps to supplement or become your retirement income. Now, before I get to the exclusion part here, 9.5 million workers, this is what's known as the welfare state. And I almost hate using that term welfare state because it carries with it a very negative connotation. Because we look at welfare, it's been kind of a derogatory term over the last 40 years, thanks to our turn to more conservative politics. But the thing is, It's also been referred to as an entitlement program. Like, people are entitled to this nowadays. They don't work hard anymore. That's not what this is, though. This is not something that's just given to you. Social Security is something that you pay into all your life. It's basically a forced investment for retirement. So you pay it into all your working life. And then when you get too old, where you can't work as hard or as long or as much or at certain jobs as you once did in your younger years, then you start withdrawing what you've already saved. It's a forced savings account. This is not some entitlement program. This is not a government handout. This is something you pay into. And what's more, when people talk about undocumented immigrants in this country, many undocumented immigrants in the modern day, at least, they have jobs. Now, however they get them, whether it's through a old Social Security card or employers not checking or whatever else, however they may do that, they are paying into Social Security through payroll taxes. But because they're undocumented, they will never get out of that program. So when people say undocumented immigrants are stealing off the system, no, they're actually paying into the system. They're supporting U.S. citizens in retirement, and they will never get the benefit thereof. But going back to 1935, originally it excluded 9.5 million workers because, once again, the South did not want to include people of color in this program. Those Southern racist politicians, and once again, FDR capitulated. He compromised, as he saw this necessary to compromise to gain support of the Southern racist Democrats and push it through Congress, in which case it excluded people that they didn't like. Now, they didn't say it in racist terms. They said, well, fine, you want to do this to the industrial workers, fine, that's northern stuff. But here in the South, we're mostly rural and farming areas. So if you are self-employed, if you're a domestic servant, house worker, or you are a farm laborer, you did not take part in Social Security. Which means, of course, for African Americans and Mexicanos, you are largely excluded from this program as originally conceived, because the vast majority, percentage-wise, of Mexican Americans and African Americans were farm workers or domestic workers or self-employed contractors. But again, FDR, not conceiving this as racist, but by giving in to compromises of the South, it becomes racist as implemented. And which means, despite being monumental, despite being a foundational piece of legislation, African Americans and Mexicanos do not benefit to any large extent initially. And the second New Deal also would see the passage of a new labor act, known as the National Labor Relations Act, to replace the NRA from the first New Deal that got struck down as unconstitutional. The National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act, gives and guarantees workers the right to organize. It guarantees the right of workers to collectively bargain through unions. And it prohibits employers from interfering. Now, in order to oversee this, the government created the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, to supervise union elections, to ensure unions have bargaining power, and to become a mitigator in case of a dispute. Secretary of Labor Francis Perkins was instrumental in this. And then she followed up in 1938, passing the Fair Labor Standards Act, establishing minimum wage, maximum hours, and banning child labor. But the question was, would the National Labor Relations Act work? Or would it go the way of the NRA? Would it allow workers to strike and form unions really? And this would be put to the test very quickly. in Flint, Michigan, my hometown, where workers at General Motors would engage in what became known as the sit-down strike of 1937. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. One, it's my hometown. Number two, my dad worked for General Motors for 30 years before he retired. My brother still works for General Motors. I grew up in a GM family. My sister worked right next to the plant that this happened in. This is a very near and dear story to my heart. In addition, in my research for my dissertation, I was fortunate and blessed to be able to interview a Mexican-American by the name of David Arceo. Now, David Arceo was born in Flint, Michigan. But his father, Raphael, who I mentioned earlier in an earlier lecture during the repatriation, he worked for General Motors in 1937. And I got to read articles about him and interview his son and listen to the stories that he told. And he recalled coming home from work at night, and he said he would literally collapse on the kitchen floor. And that as he lay there prone on the floor, his wife, Fermina, would feed him his dinner while he lay prostrate on the floor. He was too tired to get up. Another gentleman recalled their dad getting home and then sitting on the front porch of their home. It was said that his wife would come and they would help him remove his boots. And underneath was nothing but bloody socks, stemming from the horrific work conditions and the lack of workplace regulations. Listen to Arceo in his own words. I have some pictures of him there for the bottom left, him and his wife later in years. And the top right is a bronze bust of Rafael Arceo. Arceo vividly recalled the late 1920s and 1930s as he was sanding automobiles with a sponge, rag, sandpaper, and oil, saying, quote, "It was hell," unquote. The workers, regardless of ethno-racial background, experienced a crushing workload, replete with constant speed-ups, with, quote, management treating them like dogs and belittling their intelligence. The foreman controlled the whole area. He hired and he fired. It didn't make any difference to him who you were, unquote. Specifically referencing 1936, Rafael Arceo described how, quote, he and his co-workers had sworn to fight for themselves by banding together in a union. He said that one night a woman visited the small rented Arceo home and asked him if he wanted to join the union. He said his answer was quick. "Sure do," he said. A publication on the history of the UAW, the United Auto Workers Union, that would inform here, illustrated what happened next. It said, quote, Arceo and the other in-plant organizers began meeting in secret to dodge GM spies, thugs, and community sympathizers. When the company couldn't bully them into submission, it tried to buy them out by giving them a small $25 to $50 bonus. That didn't work either. Historian Sidney Fine noted that there were as many as 200 spies that were hired by General Motors to spy on the union, just in the Flint area alone. They were using a private detective agency to stave off unionization attempts. This was a perilous time. They're still in the Depression here, but they're under a crushing workload. They're dealing with speed ups. And the thing is, you have to picture this. It didn't happen at this particular plant, but another interview with a gentleman, he was talking about how one night he complained that he was sick. And the foreman said, die and prove it. Now, this gentleman, was sweating, he was shaking, and he actually passed out on the floor. And all the foreman did was say, carry him out. It was not uncommon if you were to try to complain about the speed ups or complain about the work conditions or complain about lack of bathroom access, that the foreman would simply say, come here, come here. Look out that window right there. You see all those people out there in the streets? Any one of them would want your job. If you quit right now, I fire you, I'll have 10 of them lined up right now, take your job. They would actually literally do this. Take them to the window and show them this. And so individual resistance was not something that could be done. This would take collective action. And so on December 30th, 1936, after learning that General Motors was becoming wise to a looming strike, the workers inside Fisher Body Plant Number 1, Flint, Michigan, literally took a seat for their rights, with Rafael Arceo, Frank Vargas, and Ramon Jimenez among them. In addition to the 3 Mexicanos, several African Americans also took part in the strike, making the strike a multi-ethnic affair. There were also women involved as well. Unfortunately, if I go back to one slide of the picture here, you will never see the many pictures, because once the strike starts, they organized very quickly, the men did. And they, first of all, got rid of all the women. They didn't want anyone to say that they were doing something devious or sexually assaulting women or make it anything that could be considered bad press or bad public relations. And so they're very careful when they stage their pictures for the paper. And it's an all-white affair when you just look at the pictures in the paper. But when you get to the interviews, your start seeing a much more multi-ethnic affair. And so what happens is, with normal strikes we've talked about in the past, the workers go outside and they picket, and they try to block the entrance, they try to withhold their labor. The problem is, in doing so, when they're outside, they're more subject to things like police harassment, strike breakers, and they can only do so much to prevent the businesses from bringing in scab laborers, strike breaking workers. And so in the sit-down strike of 1937 at General Motors, the UAW employed a newer type of strike known as the sit-down. In other words, you don't leave the building. Instead, you sit down within the building. Now, on the one hand, this is brilliant, because if you're in there and you're blocking the use to the equipment, they can't bring in scab laborers. You're also more easily defended from the elements. You're inside the building. You're also more defended from possible police or military presence. And so this became a brilliant idea. The downside, though, is technically speaking, you are now trespassing. It's not your business. You don't own it. And so back to the story of the sit-down strike. Rafael Arceo recalled serving proudly in the strike. He pulled guard duty once a week, protecting his fellow workers and the machinery inside the plant. Remember, if they damage the equipment in the plant, now they're guilty of vandalism. So again, you can't break anything. Now, the traditional story is that the workers stayed in the plant all day, every day, never left for 6 weeks. And that is partly true. Some people did come and go, though. Not all of them were there all the time. And Rafael Arceo was one who would come and do guard duty, and he would go home at night because his wife was pregnant. And he would go home to be with his 2 sons, David, who I got to interview, his brother Reuben, and of course, Fermina, his pregnant wife. Fermina recalled being both fearful and hopeful during the strike. She knew it was important because she had watched her husband become worn down due to speed ups. She recalled saying, quote, "I was very scared about the outcome, but I was angry too. We lost a baby only a short time before, and we couldn't even afford $9 for the funeral." I prayed for that union. I wanted a union for my husband and me, unquote. So due to her pregnancy and in the care for a sick child at home, she was unable to join the Women's Emergency Brigade you see pictured at the bottom right. You see, while the men were inside the building in the sit-down strike, their wives formed an emergency women's brigade. That, number one, they would supply food to the men inside the building by passing it through the windows. They picketed outside to bring attention to the media. And most importantly, when General Motors called in the Flint police to go into the building and break the strike by force, the Women's Emergency Brigade took their bodies and stood between the doors of the building and the Flint police with guns and batons. Think of how powerful this was. They're risking their lives as their husbands are inside. This was a family affair. And unlike normally speaking, when the police and military are called in, they rough up the workers. These were now women. Think of the public relations problem if the Flint police, on behalf of General Motors, uses batons, tear gas, guns on women who are unarmed. And this human barricade works. And so Fermina recalled being sad that she couldn't join the Women's Brigade, but she couldn't. But as she said, her heart and soul was with them. The strike would end finally on February 11, 1937, with General Motors capitulating, and the UAW, United Auto Workers Union, earning recognition with its first of the big three labor contracts, the big three being General Motors, Chrysler, and Ford. The workers sang out freedom as 800 sit-downers marched in the streets. Fermina, pregnant and all, bundled up her two sons in warm clothes and ventured out into the icy streets of Flint to celebrate with the crowds of people cheering and crying for the UAW victory. Raphael Arceo remembered thinking, quote, "Thank God for the Union. Now we don't have to work like slaves anymore. I don't think any words can describe what the Union has meant to me. If it weren't for the Union, we wouldn't have owned our home and had a little money to spend. The proudest thing for me was winning job security. It changed my life. It assured me that I would be able to feed my family. A man acts with confidence with a good union behind him," unquote. His wife added, Fermina added, quote, "After the men built the union, they worked an 8-hour day. They had more time for their families. Wages went up. Raphael now brought home $65 a week," unquote. The UAW victory brought human dignity to workers like the Arceos. The foreman could no longer take them to the window and show them potential replacements. They could no longer fire or lay off worker just because, I feel like it. This was different than past strikes. The military wasn't called in. In fact, at one point, the National Guard was called in by the new governor of Michigan, who the UAW didn't really know how he would react. He was just elected in November of 1936, and he had never spoken good or bad against unions. And so there was uncertainty. And when the National Guard was called in, they honored the Wagner Act. They didn't break the strike. In fact, when the National Guard came in, they stood outside the plant and guarded the plant, protected the workers, protected the peace. This is the Wagner Act in practice. This was no longer the government or businesses calling in the National Guard and the militias and the military to put down the strikes. This was a new day in America. The result of this was the rapid growth of unions across the country. The UAW's membership went from 30,000 to 400,000 in just 1 year. The Steel Workers Organizing Committee would have 450,000 members just 1 year after its inception. The UAW becomes the main fighters for the 8-hour workday, for cost of living increases every year, and for health insurance as being a perk of being employed. These are all thanks to the UAW, things that we take for granted nowadays. Unfortunately, though, not all unions were so fortunate. While Mexican Americans would surely benefit from the UAW, especially more in the coming years, as would other unions. Some predominantly Mexican American-led unions, however, did not fare so well. Take 1938 and the Pecan sheller strike in San Antonio. This was a organization union of pecan shellers. So, you take the pecans or the pecans and you have to shell them and get the nuts out of them. And this would be led by famed Mexicana Emma Tenayuca. This is the earliest all-female union strike. This union would be harassed. They'd be beat up at times. And Emma Tenayuca, who had been very open about her communist ideas, would be arrested and become the target of all kinds of violence. Let me show you a short video about her.
San Antonio, Texas, in the 1930s was a bustling city with a vibrant Spanish-speaking community. But as the Great Depression swept the nation, the city's underlying economic and racial inequalities became more pronounced. Workers across many industries struggled to earn living wages under poor working conditions. Then, one determined young woman stepped in and helped to set things right. Emma Tenayuca was a Latina labor activist who understood how to stand up to injustice. When she was a young girl, she listened to public speakers addressing her community. As a high school junior, she participated in her first strike. Her empathy for the plight of the workers led her to join the Communist Party and the Workers' Alliance of America. Through her work, Emma developed a reputation for effective organizing. In 1938, she and her colleagues set out to help the Pecan Shelling Union. 40% of the nation's pecans were shelled in Texas, and most of the shellers were women. Pecan shelling factories were poorly ventilated, which led to severe respiratory illnesses in workers. Under Emma's guidance, 12,000 pecan shellers went on strike, demanding higher wages and better working conditions. Emma led demonstrations and spoke at rallies. She was so successful in drawing attention that she eventually stepped out of the spotlight and worked behind the scenes. She wanted to focus on the workers, not on her. She made the right choice. The pecan shellers earned a wage increase, but Emma's success made her a target. In 1939, a violent anti-communist mob attempted to attack her while she led a party meeting. She only survived by escaping through a secret passageway in the building. In the 1940s, Emma even found herself under FBI surveillance. National distrust of communists was so great that federal agents spied on her and blocked her from government service during World War II. But Emma was a brave and passionate woman who refused to be silenced. She continued to protest, mentor, educate, and fight for workers' rights until her death in 1999. Emma Tenayuca showed the world that a young woman of color could make a real difference through activism and persistence.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. And number one, you heard the thing that Texas was the number one producer of pecans. And I know some of you will immediately say, well, she was communist. How dare she? You have to realize, though, first of all, communism is not illegal. And the ideals of communism, or theoretical communism, as we talked about previously, it's just the idea that workers should, be able to partake in the successes of their employment. That workers will band together, they will rise up, and they will control the companies that they work for. Again, theoretically, this is a good thing. And in addition, throughout early US history here, since the 19 teens, communists were the ones who were trying to help workers when the government was pushing against them and trying to help the owners get richer. And so communism was very alluring to many people. Now, again, I'm not talking about the Soviet Union here. I'm not talking about the horrific atrocities that will occur in the USSR or elsewhere in the world. But as a theoretical concept, this became a way for workers to be able to fight back. So let's try to separate an ideology, a theoretical idea, and then what actually was implemented in the Soviet Union here. And so in San Antonio alone, there are more than 400 pecan shelling plants, employing more than 10,000 workers, mostly women, who paid an entire family who worked there an average wage of about $1 to $4 a week. They were making between $1 and $4 a week. And again, so they go on strike. The Texas Pecan Shelling Workers Union in 1938 goes on strike, protesting, of course, things like low wages, crushing workloads, unsafe working environments. You mentioned the video. They were not very well ventilated. Also protesting sexual advances against the workers. Remember, their bosses, the foremen, are usually men who felt that they could, with no recourse, have sexual advances on the women. They protested child labor exploitation. Yes, by 1938, child labor will technically be banned, but we all know it still exists at some point. And so the workers began, the strike begins because there was a cut in pay. And so the wages of shellers who had been earning 6 or 7 cents a pound, it was 6 cents for pieces of pecans, 7 cents for full halves, because those are more desirable, harder to get because they sometimes break unintentionally. So those wages that were paid either at 6 or 7 cents a pound, depending on if you're doing pieces or halves of pecans, were cut to just 5 and 6 cents respectively. And so led by Emma Tenayuka, they would go on strike. And immediately the response from the outside community is one of criticism, one of attack. The Catholic Church basically disowned them. They lack support from the Mexican American middle class who see these women as being radicals. They were rejected because of their communist sympathies. They were attacked by employers and by the police. They were arrested, deported, and beaten. They were, of course, victims of red baiting, again, accused of being communist. Owen Kildee, the chief of police, stated under oath that the strike was part of a, quote, red plot, unquote, to gain control of the west side of San Antonio. Again, the old Red Scare. The picketing of 400 factories was complicated by the police actions. The chief of police, Owen Kildee, claimed that there was no strike and that the dispersed demonstrators, or he claimed that there was no strike and he set out to disperse the demonstrators and arrest the picketers. In 1 week in February, 90 male pecan shellers were arrested and imprisoned, with 200 other prisoners in a county facility that was designed to hold 60 people. They put 290 people in jail in a space for 60 people. The strike would receive national and international attention because of the mass arrests. Finally, in March of 1938, both sides would agree to arbitration. The initial settlement of 7 and 8 cents was increased because Congress passed the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, establishing a minimum wage of at least 25 cents per hour. No longer would they be paid by the pound. They're paid by the hour, which means theoretically in the past, under the weight system, you had to work your butt off, because if you didn't, you lost money, which means you tend to overwork yourself and hurt yourself and do things you shouldn't do, hurt your body irreparably. With the new Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, thanks to Francis Perkins, at 25 cents an hour, not that they didn't work hard still, but they didn't have to work themselves to the bone. Again, a tremendous change. So again, this is the success of the Wagner Act in action. The downside, unfortunately, to the Wagner Act was that it once again did not include agricultural workers, meaning that a predominantly Mexicano profession, farm labor, they were not included in the ability to organize. That won't come until the late 1970s. Now, there were other New Deal issues as well, and that includes for Native Americans who would not be excluded from New Deal programs. FDR would offer some programs to help recuperate traditional values and customs while allowing Native Americans to retain their sovereign Indian nations. This included the Indian Reorganization Act that would redistribute lands back in 1933. It restored certain Indian groups the right to own land so they could establish tribal governments. Tribal land actually increased to nearly 4 million acres. The downside, land was often barren or wasteland unsuitable for farming or hunting. Mexican Americans, however, complained that they were being excluded from this. Remember, they had a claim to land too, of land stolen from them from the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. They too, like the Native Americans, were victims of land displacement. They too argued their claims had dated back to as far when the Spanish had controlled the area. Again, remember the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, but again, they're left out. So how do we conclude the New Deal? What is the legacy of it? Well, number one, the New Deal does not end the Great Depression. So the Depression still existed by 1938. Now, did it stop the sinking further? Yes, but it did not end the Depression. It does not end the crisis. It also did not substantially alter the distribution of power and wealth. The rich were still rich, the poor were still poor. And it did not really uplift the most vulnerable, such as African American and Mexicanos. And it did continue for a large part of that, the Hoover era repatriation program. But what it did do is it created a strong economic legacy that included regulatory agencies to help stabilize troubled areas of the economy, like Wall Street and the banking system. It did create what we call the welfare state, Social Security, a social safety net. But again, it failed the neediest, especially Mexicanos and African Americans, because it did not apply to farm labor or domestic labor, house labor. Social legacy. It did try to implement non-discriminatory laws and policies. It did try to go after vigilante groups. It did try to end discrimination and lessen disenfranchisement. But often FDR was afraid to push harder for non-discriminatory policies for fear of the backlash of racist Southern senators against his New Deal programs, which were needed for everyone. And so again, it's a mixed bag here. But then we have the political legacy, probably its biggest legacy, because it took a weak and divided Democratic Party that had been a minor force in American politics since the end of the U.S. Civil War. And it turned it into a coalition that would dominate national party competitions for the next 30 years. In other words, FDR reshaped the Democratic Party into a new one and brought more people into its fold. Republicans were firmly now the party of big business and rural America. We oftentimes call the period between 1930s and 1980s as the liberal consensus. Now, this does not mean that everyone in the US was a liberal during this period. There were conservatives still, of course. But during this liberal consensus period, both major parties, mainstream party members, agreed that there was a need for a stronger federal government and that some kind of social safety net and welfare state was needed. The New Deal was very popular among Americans, and most conservative politicians would not dare speak out against it. The real difference between Republicans and Democrats post 1930 was that Democrats/liberals wanted to expand the New Deal welfare state and create even more government programs such as universal health care. Republicans, on the other hand, accepted the New Deal programs like Social Security, but they kind of sought to stop or slow the growth of these programs or slow the growth or creation of new programs. But they still, as we'll see going forward, they still expand the federal government up until this period of liberal consensus ends with Reagan's election in 1980. When we come back next time, we will see what really gets us out of the Depression, a world war. But until then, take care and bye-bye.